Hello, Dr. Dean Radin. Welcome to my Book of Light. I feel
Thank you.
honored to speak with you, to one of the most inspiring people in the world today. Dr. Dean Radin, a warm welcome again to my Book of Light. Dean Radin, you are Chief Scientist of the Institute of Noetic Science in California and Associated Distinguished Professor at California Institute of Integral Studies. May I ask, are you already enjoying your retirement or are you still affiliated to the California Institute of Integral Studies?
I'm actually working at both places, both at the Noetic Sciences and CIIS, as we call it.
Yes.
However, of course, since everyone is in lockdown mode, I'm working remotely, like all the rest of the staff.
Okay, yes. Thank you. You are the author of hundreds of scientific articles and very popular books. Let me mention the following book for your audience: Real Magic, Modern Science, and A Guide to Secret Power of the Universe. Dear Mr. Dean Radin, what else would you like to add about yourself in this introduction?
Well, I have a traditional educational background in electrical engineering and in psychology. And I've worked at major universities around the world and also major industrial research facilities. But for the majority of my professional career, I've been interested in consciousness studies. And most of that has been looking at what we would say from a mainstream perspective of anomalies of consciousness, which are things like psychic phenomena and mystical experience.
Okay. If people search you on the internet, they quickly stumble on a following quote, if I may. What exactly is magic? Why are we so attracted to the idea? Can't it really be that way? Mr. Dean is one of the few scientists who has investigated enough time and energy in seeking answers to these questions. Over the past 40 years, he conducted countless experiments, received a lot of criticism along the way. So he made the conditions for those experiments so strict that even the greatest skeptic could not find no faults. I assume you can agree with this response?
Yes, I guess in general, although depending on the nature of the skepticism, there's two kinds of skepticism. One is simply built into the fabric of the way that science is done, which I would call proper skepticism. It means doubt. You want to be sure that what you're doing is correct. So if I get someone who writes a critique about my work or the work of my colleagues, that is extremely valuable because I don't want to waste my time doing something that's not real. So we keep improving our methods. But there's a second kind of skeptic, which simply doesn't want to believe something, even if there's evidence. And so those kinds of criticisms are not very useful because they don't help advance the nature of the science.
Yes, that's so. Because many people simply reject your discoveries and as an illusion. And I would say that your book, Real Magic, demonstrates convincingly someone is looking at you, change your food by blessing, or even feeling potential future existing phenomena.
Yeah.
Are you still convinced, or are there new insights?
No, I think it's clear from the nature of the evidence itself that what parapsychology has been studying for about 150 years is exactly what people have talked about as magic, as esoteric magic for tens of thousands of years. So using modern scientific methods, we're able to say that some aspects, not all, but some aspects of traditional ideas about magic are in fact true. We don't understand it still very well, but we can show empirically that they do exist.
Yes, and this book plays an important role in the paranormal research. It proves, with strict scientific methods, that there are things that we have not yet been accepted or discussed by average researchers. And until then, we should at least call these phenomena magic. That's in the sense that there's no doubt magic is real.
Right. And at some point, the use of the word magic will go away because magic as a word is typically used for a placeholder for some other name that we don't know what it is yet. But when we do have names, we figure maybe 50 years from now, when science catches up to this, we will have names that are more specific and able to describe what we're actually talking about. So in the meantime, we'll use the word magic.
Yes. And after this layman's introduction of your CV, I hope many will find your website for further information. And at this time, to dive in the list of questions I have collected from my direct environment, including the members of the Home Circle Terra Mystica. And I'm so excited to discuss with you because you've been able to prove by scientific methods that telepathy, clairvoyance, foreknowledge, and psychokinesis do exist. And these aspects belong to the existence itself.
Right. Although I would just say that the word proof is a very strong word in science. And so we tend not to prove things from a scientific perspective. Instead, we provide evidence. And so the question is, how confident are you in that evidence? So for some kinds of psychic phenomena, we have very high confidence. For other kinds, we don't have very high confidence. So I would just want to clarify then that we're not proving, because the word proof is used in mathematics for mathematical logic and also for alcohol. I don't know if that word is true in Dutch or not, but we talk about the proof level of alcohol in English. So that's where proof is.
Okay. You are still pursuing this research, Dean?
Yep, I sure am.
Okay. How would you explain to your audience the difference between knowledge and knowing?
Well, knowledge is something that you learn either through experience or through something you read in a book, basically they're similar to each other. Knowing, as in noetic, as in the Institute of Noetic Sciences, is more like intuition, where you know something but you don't know how you know it. So in ordinary book type learning, you do know how you know it. It's either your experience or something you read. For an intuitive form of knowing, which could have very high confidence, it's accompanied by a feeling that you know that it's true, you don't consciously know how you know that.
Okay, thank you. Is it true that everyone can harness this power by learning how to tap into the energy we are all connected with?
It is true, but only in the sense that anybody can learn how to play tennis, but not everybody is going to learn to become a professional player at Wimbledon. So there are differences in natural talent and differences in personality and predilection. And so some people will become extremely good at various kinds of psychic tasks, either because they were genetically born with those talents, or that in some cases you have people who practice an enormous amount, like meditate every day and practice every day. They will get better, but even those will not go to Wimbledon.
No, of course.
Yeah.
It's maybe also a little bit like a gift.
Well, yeah, that's what I would call a natural talent is a gift. Yeah.
Is there anything outside of your personally you can connect with, like guardians, spirits, extraterrestrials, according to you?
Are you asking in general, or are you asking about me?
Well, both is interesting.
Okay, so about me, I don't have that experience, so I don't know. As far as others, we have worked with mediums and channelers and psychics, many of whom do say that they communicate with other forms of intelligence, typically that are invisible to others. Like I don't see them, I don't hear anything. But because of the studies that we've done with mediums in particular, we're able to test whether or not the information that they say they're getting from spirits is correct or incorrect, but under conditions where they can't figure it out. So it's double-blind conditions typically. And so we know that mediums can get valid information from something that I can't see. So we don't know what that is yet. We don't know how they get that information, but we do know that the information is correct.
Okay, thank you.
But the question is, will magic become part of science in the future? And I think the answer is absolutely yes. And the reason I'm confident about it is because if you look historically at how legends turned into science, we know that alchemy eventually became chemistry. We know that astrology became what we call astronomy, and herbalism became the modern pharmaceutical world. So magic has been around for at least as long as those other three practices. And it's a domain that has to do with the relationship between the mind and matter, or between mind and the physical world. And so we're still struggling with that from a scientific perspective, but we know that these kinds of phenomena exist. And if science continues along the route that it's been doing historically, science is only about 400 years old. So we're relative infants in trying to understand the nature of mind and matter. But eventually, I think, yes, what we call magic today will be part of science in the future.
Okay, that's wonderful. Isn't it so that most people will say that ESP and telepathy, for example, are not just wishful thinking and that they come from our imaginations?
Some of it does. Sure. There are lots of explanations for any given anecdotal psychic phenomena. It could be coincidence. It could be a mistake. It could be confabulation. It could be completely made up. But fortunately, because we're able to take these phenomena into the laboratory where we are able to control the conditions, we can exclude coincidence and exclude fraud and exclude all of the usual explanations, and we still see the effect. So this is how we know that the way we'd put it is that in principle, we know that these are real effects. But when we hear about any given story, because basically these kinds of experiences are described as stories that happen to people, you never know about a particular story unless it's something incredibly fantastic that a lot of people can attest to. Most of the time, these are personal experiences, and so we don't know, but we know in principle that it could be real.
Okay. Do you know also how it is that one person can connect with the souls easily, almost naturally, and the other does not even have a clue where you are talking about?
Sure. We're talking about differences in natural talent and perceptions. One thing we do know is that we interviewed 1,000 people who were starting meditation practice. And we asked them a series of questions about experiences that they had as a result of their meditative experience. And 75% of them were talking about spontaneous experiences of clairvoyance and telepathy, and all of the usual, what I would say, elementary psychic phenomena. So what this tells us is that when process of going through meditation, you're paying closer and closer attention to what's happening at deeper levels of the mind. And that strongly suggests that these kinds of things are happening all the time to everyone, but most people are not paying attention to it. So the difference between somebody who is psychically talented and somebody who is not has something to do with the degree to which they are driven by the external world as compared to the internal world, and how much filtering goes on. So I notice in general that among my friends who are very psychic and have psychic things happening all the time, their filters against their perception of the world and the world itself are very thin. They like experience the world in a raw fashion. Whereas people who are highly analytic or skeptical or whatever, they have lots of filters that prevent what is happening from being perceived. Unconsciously, they do get it, but they don't consciously get it.
No, exactly. It has also something to do with connect maybe with the feeling part of yourself and not only with the ratio.
Feeling is part of it, also creativity. So if you do a survey among people who are in an artistic profession, however that is, could be writing, but typically some kind of artist, and you ask about their belief about psychic phenomena based on their experience, it is always significantly higher than people who are not involved in artistic professions or even just creative professions.
Okay, that's interesting, yes. There's so much that the voluntary researchers at Zonneglossis Psy Research Center in the Netherlands would like to talk to you about. Therefore, it was difficult to make a choice what to ask you. Our interest in research lies in the paranormal, very normal indeed, as also the metaphysics in everything that escaped the so-called normal perception, where most current science focus on sensory perception, metaphysics focus on what escaped the perception. Two of the keywords that we use are existence and being. This is, and they are urging themselves into our research. And we get to know you, of course, through the many interviews that you have been given over the years. Is it allowed to ask you who is the man behind the scientist, Dean, and how would you describe yourself?
Is it allowed? Yes. I don't. Yeah, I don't have. I mean, for me personally, I don't have that many layers, right? I am who you see. So the one way I describe it is, my original career track was concert violinist. We started playing when I was 5 years old and played for the next 20 years, about half of that professionally. And my dad was an artist, fine artist, sculptor, and commercial artist. So I grew up in an environment where the arts and music were the primary things that we did. I spent between an hour to 4 hours a day practicing for 20 years. And at that time, I assumed as an adult that I would be a musician. I'd be playing music. But fortunately, I was also good in mathematics. So when I got to college, I realized that there was a way to make a living that did not require having to play the violin all the time. So I was good in the violin, but I always found it kind of tiring. I mean, you practice 4 hours a day, it's hard. So I found it relatively easy to do mathematically oriented science. And so that's why I ended up going into engineering, electrical engineering, because I like to make things too. So the reason I think why I became interested in psychic phenomena is because as a child, I read lots and lots of fairy tales and then lots of science fiction. And my mom was involved in yoga very early on. So we had books around the house about the amazing masters of the Far East and that sort of thing. And I think like a lot of children, you begin to wonder after a while, is this pure fantasy, all of these stories? Because tales of the powers of the mind are saturated within fairy tales and science fiction. And there are lots of stories that suggest that they're true. These stories about the masters, the gurus, and so on. So maybe in today's world, you find a child who has read all of the Harry Potter books and also has the same question. Is it real or is it just pure fantasy? So I decided when I was maybe 12 or 13 years old that it would be nice if there was a way to actually test it, right? You have stories, but how do we test the stories? That's when I discovered that there was a discipline of parapsychology. And so then I got really interested because I saw how scientific methods could be used to address the question of, is this real or not? And so I started reading all of that literature. And by the time I got even to college, I had read basically everything that you could find. And then I discovered in college that I had missed a gigantic part of the literature, which were the journal articles, because I was reading books at that point. So I started reading the journal articles. And by the time I was through with graduate school, I decided that if it was possible to work as a scientist in the field of parapsychology, that's what I wanted to do. And so I managed over the years to figure out ways of doing that. And for the majority of my career as a scientist, I've been paid full-time to do this kind of research.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. But also to have so much critics around you by other scientists or people, there must be a very big driving force in you to persist the research. And where did that come from? Where did you get this strength?
Well, part of it is that I don't care very much what other people think, right? So if I cared a lot, that doing a career in this realm is risky. It's risky from a social perspective and from a financial perspective. I've always been driven by curiosity. That's the primary driver for me. And I figure also that you don't need to read a lot about the history or the sociology of science to find that all of the breakthroughs are initially rejected, oftentimes fiercely and vigorously, because we're always pushing against the status quo about what we think reality is like. And so I knew this very early on, that some people simply don't like to think about things that are not part of the status quo. And I guess maybe it's also part of growing up in an artistic family where you're always pushing. This is the joy of art in many ways, and music too. You're pushing against what is conventional. So I wasn't interested in the conventional. I was interested in things that advance us in some way. And that then is the passion, the combination of not being that interested in the status quo and not caring too much about what other people think.
And having, of course, good results, and results that you get more questions of.
Well, it's true. Early on, all of the research I was doing, I was trying to repeat what others had described. And so I was going to conferences and I met the researchers. And I had also at that time been working with places like Bell Laboratories, which at the time was one of the world's top labs. So I knew lots of smart people. I knew how science worked. And the people I was meeting who were doing these parapsychological experiments were every bit as smart, and they were doing science in the proper way. So I learned early on that while this does not fit the mainstream ideas about the way that reality works, nevertheless, there's good science going on that shows that they're wrong. So part of that, I think, appeals to me as well. You're on the leading edge of learning something using the same tools and techniques that other scientists are using to reveal something about the nature of reality and our role in it. So what could be more interesting than that?
Nothing. I believe so. According to Not Local Awareness, I quote 2 sentences from the website from the Institute of Noetic Science. The way we understand ourselves and the world is always evolving, from instinct to intuition to intellect. Part of being human is using multiple ways to gather and utilize information. Do you mean that part of us as a human being exists on another level that can do this? Can you explain this quote?
Well, not necessarily another level. There are models of the mind, just as there are models of the physical world, that suggest that we live in many dimensions, right? So string theory has maybe 12 dimensions. It depends on what model you're talking about. But there have been a lot of speculations that to describe the nature of the physical world and the way that we perceive it and measure it, we need more than 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time. So these are multidimensional models. There are similar models that say that the same must be true of mind. Because after all, from a very conventional point of view, we are creatures in a multidimensional physical universe. So presumably our minds must be part of that too. And the moment you start thinking about mind being embedded in something that is more than 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time, then suddenly all of the psychic phenomena become not exactly trivial to understand, but certainly much easier to understand. So multidimensional mind is one way of thinking of it. You immediately can have effects that look non-local from space-time point of view. If the mind was able to exist in some form in a 4th or 5th or 10th dimension, then all of these anomalies would begin to disappear pretty quickly. So that is one way of thinking about it. It's actually quite a mainstream way, right? This doesn't even require any metaphysical ideas at all. It's simply saying that if our models are correct and we live in a multidimensional physical world, then our minds must do that too, if you imagine that mind and body are linked in some very important way.
Yes. And if we understand ourselves, if I may say, as a not local awareness, a kind of consciousness, does it imply that we're all connected? And if so, is there a proof for this?
Well, it does. One implication is yes, that it would imply that we are connected in ways that would not make sense from a conventional space-time perspective. When I say space-time, I mean 3 space, 1 time. So if there are other dimensions, then if you think of higher dimension as the way we would talk about it, but it's not really higher, it's just another dimension. From higher dimensional perspectives, it connects everything below that. So yeah, we could be in some kind of a multidimensional holographic space where everything is connected at some level.
So if so, could it perhaps mean that a mental mediumship can be explained as a consequence of this mental connectedness? I mean, a medium can access to the consciousness memory of the living and the deceased.
Right. So it still is a question, though, about whether the deceased exist in a form where that entity, let's say, is a living thing in the way that we think of ourselves as living. In other words, a conscious being with memory and personality and all the rest. That we can't say with high certainty. What we can say about mediumship is that people can get accurate information, that the perception is that it's coming from somewhere else or someone else. But so far, we have not been able to figure out proof positive, or not even proof, but strong evidence positive that there is an actual independent being. And so that part, we just haven't figured out how to do it yet. At some point, maybe we'll be clever enough and we'll figure it out. But at this stage, I would say that there's strong evidence, not just from mediumship, but across the 8 or so different forms of evidence for survival, that something persists. But is it an independent personality? That we don't know.
No, okay. The contact can be spontaneous if there is only awareness of consciousness that can be reached with an open mind and practice of intention and focus. Is this observation supported by your own research?
Sure. Yeah. The intention, attention, belief, all of these, there's 4 or 5 different characteristics that seem to strongly modulate what people experience and what they think about these phenomena.
Yes. Man's perception is focused on the earthly task and will deny it with his biased reasoning, don't you think?
Well, I know people who are physicists who study the earthly world, and yet they also have a very strong interest in psychic phenomena. So you could not tell from somebody's profession because we're talking about typically their experience. They've had an experience that they can't easily reconcile with what they've learned. And that experience is the thing then which makes them interested. And the vast majority of people have had 1 or more experiences. In fact, we did a survey among engineers and scientists to specifically ask about different experiences they had to find what the prevalence was in the general population. And what we found was over 90% of engineers and scientists, people whose professions are in science and engineering, they've had 1 or more psychic experiences. They tend not to talk about it because you're not supposed to. There's a taboo, but nevertheless, it is very common.
Yes, yes. Okay, so we are connected on a certain level with the energy around us. What kind of benefit do you think can humans get out of this knowledge?
That is a very important question. And so I'm asked that question sometimes. Like I would call it the so what question, right? We can demonstrate telepathy is a real thing. Well, so what? What is it? Well, the so what answer is that a case can be made that many of the ills of the world, of the entire globe and our lives, are based on what we think consciousness is. So from a mainstream scientific perspective, we consider ourselves, especially from the neuroscience perspective, that we are machines made out of meat. And that means that consciousness is either meaningless or a side effect, and it doesn't really mean anything. So this kind of idea, which comes directly out of materialism, which is the doctrine of science, it leads to a nihilistic philosophy, a philosophy where nothing really matters. There's no purpose to anything. You die and you're dead. There's no other intelligences in the world, and so on. that kind of philosophy, especially for younger people, is very depressing because you figure after a while, what's the point of anything?
Exactly.
Why do anything? Well, this all devolves down to the question of what is consciousness? What are we capable of? Who are we? Those kinds of questions. So the reason then why parapsychology and any kind of psychic phenomena is interesting to study is because it informs that question. Right? We have an esoteric tradition, which is tens of thousands of years old, which says, no, actually, the universe is extremely permeated with meaning. Purpose is embedded into the fabric of reality. Consciousness is vast, and it's not just human. There's all kinds of consciousness. So having a different perspective like that is trying to understand what is the nature, what is our true nature. And of course, this is what every guru is always talking about too. Who are you really? That kind of question. So this is not simply an academic pursuit to try to figure out, does telepathy exist? It's a much deeper pursuit. We're looking at how do we begin to understand what consciousness is and its role in the physical world. And if we knew that better, and I suspect, and others as well suspect, that if we understood our true nature better than we currently do, it may solve some of the problems of the world, because it would change our philosophy from one of nihilism to one which is the complete opposite, where meaning permeates the universe. That's why it's important.
And the perception from me to we, a different kind of thinking, that we're part of everything.
Right.
This is so.
Yeah.
Yes, this is most interesting, because the phenomena can prove things, but what comes with it is the knowledge of really what is the connection and the power that we're part of.
Right.
If I can say that way. Yes, I believe so. Very much. A total different question now. When you do research with people, what are the criteria that fit the research objective? Or how do you select the people for your research?
Well, that depends on what we're looking for. So if we're studying people or mediums, we work with people who are professionals, which typically means that that's their main profession for at least 5 years. And we also check references and that sort of thing. We've worked with maybe 24, 25 mediums at this point, that all of whom are like that. We've done study with healers. We use the general term of biofield or energy healing, but it's a very broad range of different kinds of healers. Some are psychic and spiritual and all kinds of different healers. Well, they have to be professionals too. Sometimes we want to know if something is true in general. So if I'm studying something like presentiment, like unconscious precognition, we'll take anybody, because we're not asking somebody to be a professional. We're simply saying, is part of your unconscious mind extended through space and time? And so the answer to that would tell us, is this true in general? And if we wanted to know about certain people being better, well, then we would go for people who report that they have precognitive experiences.
All the studies that you have done with people, mediums, healers, and so on, are done in their awakening state?
No, most of them are in a waking state. Some are in meditative states. We work with trance channelers who are in trance. We haven't, but our colleagues have done studies in dream states. And informally, we sometimes use psychedelic states. The law in the United States is very far behind, as it is in the Netherlands. So it is still difficult to do studies involving psychedelics. But I've talked to researchers who are doing those studies, and they keep encountering various psychic abilities, and they want to figure out ways of incorporating psychic tasks into their more mainstream research, where people are typically taking something like psilocybin and sometimes DMT.
Oh, really? Okay. Interesting, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
According to your book, Real Magic, magic is, so to speak, divinity, force of will, theurgy.
Mm-hmm.
It means when you are aware of this, that there is a consciousness in when we can connect. That's correct, isn't it?
Sure, and connected with everything, not just other minds, but with matter as well.
Yes. And do you believe that matter, that in the beginning there was first a kind of thought before there was matter? That matter, that the mind or the let's say consciousness can create matter?
Well, this goes down now to a philosophical position, right? So if you're an idealist, then the answer is yes, that matter and the physical world emerges in some way out of mind with a capital M, or consciousness with a capital C. The other approach, though, sometimes called neutral monism, says that the physical world is a real thing. It is the way it is. It's the way physics pretty much describes. But there's another aspect to reality, which is mind, which is not separate from matter, but another aspect of it. And so sometimes called panpsychism, or I use the metaphor of a coin. So a coin has two sides. One side is mind, the other side is matter. They're very tightly correlated with each other, but they're not the same either, right? Heads and tails are not the same thing. So we don't have good explanations yet as to which one of the philosophies is correct. I tend to lean towards idealism as a way of thinking about these kinds of phenomena, because it leaves what we know about the physical world completely intact. We don't change anything about existing physics or chemistry or anything else that we know. So the lawfulness of what science has learned is correct, except that we need a new assumption. The assumption is that consciousness permeates everything. And with that assumption, then suddenly, again, psychic phenomena become much, much easier to understand. And this is not at this point talking about multidimensional mind, but simply that it's truly the fundamental, and things emerge out of it. So what
that's
I
what
just
I meant. That's what I try to ask you. Yes.
Right. So that this is the esoteric worldview. This has been around for tens of thousands of years as compared to science, which is a few hundred years. Some aspects of it are probably not right, but I think it's more correct than materialism. So that's why I tend to lean towards idealism. And interestingly, almost all of the founders of quantum mechanics were idealists. So holding a philosophy of idealism says nothing about whether your physics is good or not. It just comes from a different perspective.
Yes, absolutely. That's so. And I must say that I'm aware, and who am I, but through my researches and experiences, that from my consciousness can influence in a way the matter, as you say, about food, you see. So also with the, let's say, so-called ITC, spirit photography and so on, there are big influences and big progress that we make with connecting with this consciousness. Doesn't have to call it a spirit, or you doesn't have to call it a name, but this consciousness we're part of, and we can make it visible, and even so visible that even on film or video we can see the entity. If you take some effort to look at it well and take the time, you can see them. They can close their eyes and they can open it on video. So you see, this is really the case. And so it goes further and further to have more connection and to understand that we truly influences ourselves from in the connection. It's amazing, isn't it, with images. And with film, video, we does is not because of we like to see some, let's say some show or so, but really to think behind it, that if we are connected, can this imply, what can this mean for us in life, in the world?
Right.
And also with the EVP, I shared with you some words about in our correspondence. Mm-hmm. It's amazing to have connections, very accurate connection, and conversation like we have, like now. Mm-hmm. It goes like that. If I, by example, ask some questions to, let's say, my guides, let's call it my guides, or the guide of someone else, then the connect, and everybody approves it, the intention is right, the ethics for me are very important, are okay, then there is a conversation that give answers. Mm-hmm. And has not answer in a way that I could expect from my, let's say, daily awareness. I would not answer, I will not have these questions answered that way. So it's a surprise sometimes what I can hear. And of course, it's amazing that distance has no influences. You can be on the other side of the planet. I only need your approve. And a name is not even so important. But if I know you approve, then there is my experience, there is a connection made by a part of me that I don't see, but it's there, and the other one, and there is an exchange of information. Mm-hmm. And this is amazing, isn't it? If it's true what I'm telling you, then it's amazing, isn't it?
Well, it's consistent with what we see in the laboratory. Generally for professional practitioners, let's say, the effects that you can see in your own laboratory, meaning your house, when you do these things, they tend to be stronger than what we see in the lab. So I'm generally not too surprised that there can be very strong evidence that's outside of the laboratory, because in the lab, by design, the tasks that we ask people to do are artificial, right? We need you to be psychic right now under conditions that we need. Whereas if you're doing it with very high motivation and interest and so on, without the laboratory constraints, yeah, what you can get is much stronger. It also, unfortunately, is more difficult to describe to others as scientific evidence, because it's not scientific evidence, but it's still evidence.
It's amazing, because if you don't know anything from those people, and there are really objective things going on in their life, where you can share with them about, or about their children or so on. And there is a kind of connection, 100% for me, 100% sure, no doubt at all, that this connection can be made instantly with the right intention, focus and proof of that, instantly and accurately. And most of the time, audibly, I can hear it, and others, sometimes they can hear it as well. Mm-hmm. And of course, when you do it in laboratory circumstances, in a laboratory of someone else, there will be a stress component, because you want to perform well.
Yes.
It's different, of course, but still, it is also a matter of practice and experience. And if they feel good of it, and you are very certain inside yourself that it is okay and that it can be done, it almost never fails. And it is not to find. I don't know if you have heard from Robin Foy from the Skull experiment.
I know about that experiment, yes.
Yes. So I just talked to him a week ago, and he said, in my time, it is still his time, of course, but in the past, he was discussing with a friend, and he was doing also electric voice phenomena, and he said we tried to make it a game, how many words we could receive in 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. And nowadays, it's not how many words, it is just a chat, a conversation from 1 minute till in 1 minute are enormously much sentences. And of course on high frequencies you have to make that a little bit, slow it a little bit down. Because the thinking process goes more quicker than talking.
So you generally are hearing the results?
Absolutely, everybody can hear them.
No, I mean that your perception of what's going on is that it's auditory, so you're clairaudient.
No, I'm not clairaudient. I tape it. It's the electronic voice phenomena I can do on the computer. I don't need. There are different ways of achieving this, and they can give exactly information from now all kinds of philosophical questions that I ask them. They truly, and I call them my spirit team who's helping me with all of this work. They are really something. They are achieving so much and doing so great work. And they truly want to do that because of the reason that I do it from the unconditional love for understanding that we are all connected. So this is their drive to help me with my experiences and my proof and to help people around me. And yes, I'm sharing a lot. I hope you don't mind.
No, it's interesting.
You can see me. I just want to come back to the excellent expose and the rationale you gave from the scientific perspective. That was really enlightening because there are two things here. People sometimes put science on a pedestal and not taking its real essence to its heart. So thank you for that excellent explanation at the beginning of this interview. That is really helpful, I think. The second thing is actually challenge your own rationale. Now, if indeed we are somehow a three-dimensional projection of an n-dimensional entity, which is, for a mathematician, trivial. Yeah, let's put it, and I'm a mathematician as well, so it's trivial. But how about the logic? So, how does the logic actually translate to the n-dimensional space? Because I see a tendency that people think that the logic we use in this dimensional space is the same as which governs into the n-dimensional space, which I think isn't. But that's my mouth jumping in.
Right.
What would you think about it?
Yeah, so when we think about logic, we usually think about Aristotelian logic, right? And there are many other logics, and the one I think I don't remember if I talked about this in Real Magic or not, but at minimum, four-valued logic is pretty common in India, and it provides a very different way of thinking about things as simple as true and false.
Exactly.
So it's quite true, I think. If we live in a multidimensional reality, then the ranges of logic that would be mathematically pristine but very outside of the everyday reality is almost certainly there.
Yes, only in the Netherlands I know 22 logicians who have all their own logical machineries, and they all, from their own perspective, in their own isolation, they are correct.
Yeah.
Whatever correct means.
Yeah, much has to do with your perspective and your model of reality. And I think reality is rich enough to allow, if there are 7.5 billion people on Earth, well, we could have 7.5 billion different philosophies, all of which are correct, and there are probably many more than that are available.
Exactly. Thank you, Martin.
Do you get words sometimes that you don't understand? Words?
They try to explain to me on a way that I can understand.
I see.
And sometimes I need to readjust my way of thinking because I understand now more from what they're explaining than it was before.
Okay. Well, I'll be very interested to hear what you come up with.
Okay. If you like, I will absolutely inform you for what we are doing. So thank you so much for this interesting video. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.